Hello, and welcome to the latest of the 2020 quarantine lectures. This short lecture is going to be about the difference between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. So far during our semester, we've talked about what utilitarianism is, right? Where you have ethics that's concerned with reaching good consequences. And there's different types of utilitarianism. We've been talking most about John Stuart Mill's model of trying to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number. And that's the ideal consequence that you're trying to reach through your actions. Okay, so there are other types as well, but we've talked about that up to this point. What I want to talk about now is a differentiation of two different types of utilitarian ethics. That can fit with Mill's model, certainly, but it's still an important differentiation. So the first of these is act utilitarianism. And act utilitarianism is an approach to utilitarian thinking where you approach a situation and decide what act will achieve the greatest good for the greatest number in this situation. What should I do here and now so that I can achieve the greatest consequence? And chances are that that's how you've been thinking about utilitarian ethics. What you've probably been thinking about as utilitarian ethics is act utilitarian. Rule utilitarianism is a little bit different and maybe a little tricky to get your head wrapped around. But the basic idea is this. You want to create a rule, the following of which will create the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. That is to say, you're going to come up with a rule and you're always going to try to follow that rule. And if you always follow that rule, ultimately, in the end, that will achieve the greatest consequence. However, there may be times that when you follow this rule, that it may not reach the greatest consequence in every situation, right? There may be situations where when you follow the rule, it actually leads to something less optimal, a worse consequence. But you believe that if you, instead of trying to figure things out situation by situation, you always follow the rule. And if you always follow the rule, in the long run, that will achieve the greatest good for the greatest number. And so that's rule utilitarianism. Okay, so let's look at a quick example. We've talked about the ticking time bomb scenario where you catch a terrorist who's planted a time bomb, and the question is, should you torture the terrorist to find out where the time bomb is and maybe find it and defuse it and save thousands of lives? This is a classic ethical question that people talk about. So the first thing to remember when we talk about utilitarianism is utilitarians don't always agree. There are times that people say, oh, well, the utilitarian position is this. But utilitarians disagree, right? We're talking about predicting the future, and we know that we can't always predict the future. In fact, we can never predict the future perfectly. And so utilitarians disagree about that. So bear that in mind, first of all. So if you have some act utilitarians and you confront them with this question of torturing the terrorist to find the time bomb, there may be some utilitarians who say, yes, you should torture the terrorist because at least then you stand a chance of finding the time bomb and saving thousands of innocent lives. And that's a greater good. Right? You understand that. Most students make that sort of argument when confronted with the situation. You could also imagine other act utilitarians disagreeing and saying, no, you shouldn't torture the terrorist, even if there's a possibility, because torture usually doesn't work in terms of finding out the information that you want. And even if it did, then you're setting a precedent for future situations where torture is now justified. And if word gets out that the United States government is torturing people, that can embolden our enemies and form and serve as a recruiting device for them. So utilitarians can disagree on that. And these act utilitarians will be like, all right, what are we going to do right now in this ticking time bomb scenario? What will achieve the greatest good for the greatest number? The rule utilitarians would be much more likely to say, I don't know what would achieve the greatest good for the greatest number in this situation, but if we all live by the rule, don't torture people, ultimately that will serve the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. ultimately that will achieve the greatest consequence that we could hope for if we always agree to follow that rule. That's the better way to approach the situation, is just always follow that rule instead of asking each time there's a situation, is it okay to torture? Is it not okay to torture? Let's just always follow this rule. And so that's how a rule utilitarian would be more likely to approach that sort of issue. Okay, there are some misunderstandings, so let's quickly clear these up. Act utilitarians aren't only thinking about the immediate consequences. Act utilitarians can and do think about second and third order consequences. They do think about precedents that get set. So they're not just thinking what will happen right here and now. They are thinking about secondary and tertiary reactions and responses and results of this sort of decision. So they're not thinking short term. At least the good ones. So we don't want to associate that with act utilitarianism. The other thing that's a little bit tricky is that if you think about this, then you start wondering, well, what's the difference between rule utilitarianism and deontology, right? Both of them come up with rules and say, you should always follow this rule. And that's true. It's true that both rule utilitarianism and deontology have this great emphasis on rules and tell you you should always follow the rule. And so they can function in a very similar way. The difference is more philosophical. The question is, for the deontologist, the rule is absolute. It's universal. It's always true. And so for the act utilitarian, it's more pragmatic, right? The act utilitarian, the rule utilitarian is saying, here's the rule that we're going to go with. Not because it is God's will, not because it is an absolute principle of duty that applies to all human beings, but because we think it's a really good rule that's going to function well and bring about the best consequences. And so a rule utilitarian, you're going to have an easier time trying to get them to change rules than you are a deontologist, because the deontologist sees the rules as absolute, universal, and the rule utilitarian recognizes these are rules that we're coming up with trying to achieve good consequences. Okay, so that in a nutshell is act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism, two of the dominant approaches within utilitarianism, and they're not distinct from what Mill or Bentham are talking about, but are ways of further dividing their approach to consequentialism or utilitarian ethics. So that's all for today. It was a quick one. Any questions, complaints, or critiques, please leave them in the comments below and stay safe.